If you're an HR professional who works hard to fill roles within your company, keep employees engaged, and build company culture, welcome to America Back to Work, where dreams only work if we do. We'll share wide-ranging issues surrounding pre-employment background screening, HR topics such as recruiting, hiring, labor trends, and company culture, as well as broader HR-influenced business topics such as customer experience, service level excellence, and protecting what matters through best practices in prevention, protection, and corporate security. America Back to Work is brought to you by S2 Verify. Here's your host, Arnett Heinz.
Welcome to America Back to Work, brought to you by S2 Verify, where our purpose is to help you hire with confidence and manage insider risk. I'm your host, Arnett Heinz. Thank you for joining. Today, our guest is Lydia Wu. Lydia is a results-driven and customer-centric HR leader who helps companies transform their leadership and HR functions. Lydia gained experience working at large consulting firms and is currently supercharging the future of EV battery manufacturing as the Director of HR Strategy and Technology at Panasonic Energy of North America. Lydia, quite a background there. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to explore with you the areas of how you see AI impacting HR today. But before we jump into that, would you mind sharing a little bit more about your career and how you got to this point where HR and technology are intersected?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me here, first of all. So I think the answer, like many other HR practitioner, is really two words: by accident. And my happy accident happened back in the mid-2010s, if we recall, when HR cloud systems were all the rage. Everyone was going from on-prem to cloud implementations. And I remember sitting there as a change management consultant at the time with Accenture, thinking to myself, what on earth are we going to do with all the data in the cloud? Because effectively, we may have just turned a very heavy physical paperweight of all of the on-prem systems into a very heavy paperweight in the sky or in the cloud with all of the HR data. And really, that was my very, very first question, thinking about it back to it now. That has led me into the exploration of what does technology mean for the practice of HR? How does technology better bring HR to the conversations of the business and better support the business? And ultimately, how does technology help propel the human potential and the human possibility faster and forward in the workplace?
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. So let's get right to it to talk about AI and how you see its role with HR today. What's going on in the industry, and how do you see it happening right now?
Yes. So I call this, for some reason, the AI race in HR as we're seeing it in the industry today. If I can take us back in time a little bit to about February of 2023, so only about 10 months ago at this point, there wasn't a whole lot of conversation on AI. ChatGPT just opened up about 3 months ago. Everyone's like looking at it, poking around with it. ChatGPT's UI is definitely not quite where it is today. And HR is not even really looking at it fully. Fast forward to around May and late spring this year, all of a sudden, everyone is talking about generative AI as if it's a new thing on the market. I think it's one of those things where the HR function and the HR as an industry has woken up to the technical potential, the culmination of everything that they have been trying to build towards over the last decade or two is all finally kind of unraveling in front of them to say, oh, this is what the final outcome and the final product could be. But hang on, it's a little bit scary because the final outcome and product can completely replace me and what I do today. So I think in the industry, the sentiment is a little bit mixed. There is definitely a whole load of excitement in terms of what does AI actually mean? What can it possibly do for us? There's a little bit of caution because, of course, personally identifiable data, compliance, regulatory environment all comes into play in our world. And if I may, I think subconsciously there's also an element of fear in terms of if you spend decades of your career building yourself in HR, the HR function and everything else, now comes this new piece of technology that could have a lot of disruptive power. And that is scary, to put it in certain ways, but also exciting in certain other ways.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. So can you cite what you think are maybe one or two of the most widely adopted applications that are leveraging AI right now?
Absolutely. So, funny story. HR has been actually using AI in some form or the other for a good part of the last 5 to 6 years en masse, I would argue. So what we consider to be AI today is actually generative AI. But prior to generative AI, there's also been a lot of generations of AI and iterations of AI as technology. Ask any HR function, and I can guarantee you there is some form of a chatbot that currently exists in their technology stack. And whether we like to believe it or not, the notion of how a chatbot gets coded, how the rules are brought into the chatbot environment, how we essentially train a chatbot to do what we need it to do is quite frankly, in fact, AI. I think that, to answer your question, is one of the most commonly adopted use cases of AI in HR today, which is the co-pilot, the chatbot, the tier 0 self-service, if you will, in our world. The second component of it is if we look at how we do compensation and total rewards. It's a lot of calculations. It's a lot of math. And there's no denying that there is a lot of human perception and human decision-making that goes into the designing of a total rewards package in an organization. But let's take a step back for a moment. Where do we access the data? How do we differentiate the geographic data? How do research companies turn survey data into the benchmarks that we're using today? And ultimately, how do we get all the benefit package information and come up with an economic model that makes sense to us? Again, there are AI components in a lot of the calculation and a lot of the data that we use to distill the human decision that we make on a daily basis. Just because up until recently we haven't been fully made aware of it doesn't mean that the technology hasn't existed in our world in a more underlying manner, if you will.
Yeah. You touch on a point that I think is so often overlooked, even in my industry right now, in pre-employment background screening. Our company has been using aspects of AI for 5, 6, 7 years, but it wasn't widely discussed or focused on. And now with everything related to Chat GTP, that brought attention to everybody about generative AI, and so I think you're right. I think there's a lot of industries that have used some aspects of artificial intelligence, and now it's coming, being discussed a lot more.
Absolutely. I look at AI to our industry today and really to society in general, if you will, as the disruptive power that internet had when it first came to market. If you think about it, internet has existed in different applications much longer prior to the mass consumer adoption of it. When it became the mass consumer adoption part of the internet back in sort of the late 80s, early 90s timeframe, the same sentiment towards internet that we had then of, oh my goodness, what does it mean to me? What does it mean to the work that I do? What does it mean for all of the knowledge that I have retained over time, et cetera, is the exact or incredibly similar to the sentiment that we're all feeling towards AI right now. And what I find fascinating, and just citing from the history books, if you will, is the fact that eventually it became a point where the technology is just so ingrained in your daily lives that you don't even think about it. I mean, let's ask our audiences, how many times do they pull out their phone and think to themselves like, oh, I have to be connected to get access to what I need access to? It's almost an underlying assumption that it's there and it's part of our everyday lives. And that's where I see AI going 5 years down the road, possibly, if not sooner.
Yeah. So, there's always, a bell curve on the integration of technology. Are we still in the early adopter phase for AI, or have we passed that?
So if I were to speak to the consumer market, I think we're in the early to mid stages. If I were to ask my parents, do they know how to use AI or what AI is? They'll have a general idea. I don't think they would have used it. Even in conversations with my husband, I had to show him like, look at this cool thing that ChatGPT just did for me. I think in the industry of HR, we are most definitely still in the early adopter stages. And here's the thing, understandably so, we don't know what we don't know. And as the sort of compliance, governance, historically driven organization in any corporation, HR doesn't necessarily, as a function, want to take that bold step forward into the unknown without somebody having tested out first. So I would argue that there's a lot of us who are in the industry who are playing around with AI on a smaller scale from a pilot and from a beta testing perspective. But we are definitely waiting for a lot more signals. For example, the European AI regulation that just passed this week, I believe, to be enforced in 2025. We're still waiting for a lot more of those regulatory signals to help us draw the sandbox in terms of how far is too far and what is safe. Because as much as we can make our own decisions, there comes a point where we all have to admit we don't know what we don't know. And with the popularization of AI, there's also a lot of vendors, whether we like to admit it or not, out there who claim to have AI, who claim to have ethical data models, who, when you dig a little bit deeper into it, raises certain question marks from a security and compliance standpoint.
Yep. So let's suppose we have a HR team and their leadership decides, hey, let's make a more aggressive step into leveraging AI. Where should they start?
So this is where I'm going to give you the most boring answer you'll probably get out of anyone by asking this question. Start at the foundation. Start at your data technology stacks. Because here's the thing. AI only works when there's massive volumes of data going into it, training it and feeding it to come up with its own logic model and reaction to certain events. If your data isn't perfect or if your data is biased and if you're not collecting the data in the first place, AI is not going to whip up some magic and give you the answer. So taking talent acquisition, for example, if for whatever reason you're not collecting the data at every stage of the funnel to help you understand what recruiting channels, what branding sources, what advertising mechanisms are the most effective and efficient for your organization, no AI is going to answer the question of where should I hire the role of a software engineer from, because that data does not exist in your environment. So the adoption of AI, I think, while propels HR as an organization forward and as a function forward, simultaneously, it also forces us as an industry to look back on the last decade and a half of work that we have done in technology and ask ourselves a really, really hard question of, did we build our infrastructure right? Do we need to reinforce our infrastructure? And are we collecting the data that we absolutely need to help us drive towards that future state of where we want to be and to help us answer those questions? I think on the opposite end, from a cognitive thinking and reasoning perspective, it also forces HR to not be in the moment in terms of reacting to employee inquiries, managerial inquiries, or anything along those lines, and pushing us to think about 3 to 5 years ahead. Because in order to do what we want to do then, we need to be able to start building that infrastructure now and start thinking ahead in terms of data collection now.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is an appropriate point to view this issue, but if you're using AI in HR, what kind of results are teams seeing right now? Are they able to leverage their own information through AI, and what kind of examples come to your mind?
I think it really is team dependent, because I will argue that there are always those HR functions with seemingly unlimited funding and the ones who have to bootstrap and make things work with the deck of cards that they're dealt with. So I think the answer will differ for everyone. But what I will say is that in terms of results, it really depends on what the organization wants to commit to. If you want to commit to a pre-built data model or a tool that is built on an existing data model, then of course you'll see a lot more results because there's been a lot more data going into training of the model. But that's also where the trust equation becomes a bit of a question, because how do you know that the mass data is reflective of your internal environment, your internal context, and the decisions that you're making related to your employees? And I think this is also the reason why I don't think there are any, or at least I have not seen any organizations allowing AI to be the sole decision maker or the sole qualifier on the entire HR process. I think on the other hand, with the organizations who have a lot more access to funding, we're really just in the initial stages of training a data model to think like the internal HR team. Because even if somebody has had a HR system in place and data from 20 years, strangely enough, sometimes that's still not enough to train an AI model. And we still need a lot of assistance in terms of truly getting that model up to the level of intelligence and out of the infancy or the adolescent years, if you will, from a maturity standpoint. And I think the industry is working on it, but I am hopeful that in the next 6 to 8 months, we'll see a lot of progress in terms of leap and bounds and a lot further understanding in terms of the criticality of data and the criticality of well-architected, clean data in the process of AI for HR.
Yep. So let's look at ethical and biases that might be associated with information or results that AI tools are producing for HR. Have you come across anything like this?
So not personally, but here is how I think about it. There is bias when there are people involved. That is just a fundamental fact. Regardless of whether we like it or not, humans are inherently biased. So when HR systems are built on data that is generated and passed through a human hand, inherently, no matter which way you cut it, every set of HR data, I would argue, is biased in some way or form or shape through history, influence, or whatever it may be. And this is where we really need to balance the technology and human equation in terms of what is the mix. Because I will never argue for a full technology model, at least at this point of maturity based on the AI market and the technology market. Where I have seen a lot of successful use cases is where AI acts as a co-pilot. Because if you look at anybody who works in HR and ask them if there are parts of their jobs that they don't want to do, I can guarantee you there's laundry lists that are going to be generated from the entire HR team. Get the AI to focus on those. I think right now where the value of AI is really taking the more mundane and repetitive tasks, non-value added ones, if you will, out of the human hands and allowing the person to focus more on the thinking component to it. And I think this is where the co-pilot conversation comes into play as well, in that when you're driving with Google Maps or Apple Maps on, sure, it provides guidance. It tells you to turn at the next light. It tells you to stop at the stop sign and make a left, so on and so forth. But if you as a driver see ahead that there is an accident or a traffic stop or whatever it is, you are going to say, no, thank you, Google or Apple Maps. I'm going to turn the other way. I know a better route around. And that is effectively the relationship we need to build in HR between human and technology, whether it's AI, whether it's cloud technology or other forms, in that let the technology do most of the routine heavy lift, but always make sure there is a person in place come for the proverbial HR traffic stop that can really redirect, reroute, and allow their better judgment to guide them as opposed to technology.
Yeah. So let's modify that last question and look at legal and compliance challenges. I mean, that's a step up, but are you coming across challenges like that?
Yes. Challenges in terms of having even just conversations around it, right? Because it's so open right now that everything seems to be a bit of a gray area. So legal challenges, let's start with that. And then we can go into compliance in terms of how much is too much? How much is too much data that you're collecting? How much is too much data that you're sharing with third parties? Especially from a vendor and technology platform perspective. That's a conundrum that I think everyone who works in the HR technology space is struggling with, and even more so with the rapid rise of AI, because you never know if your third-party vendor is going to use your data to train their AI model, quite frankly. So there's a lot more due diligence that's required in the marketplace today. And then the other component of it too is how do you design your inherent HR technology architecture so that you future-proof yourself? And when you share the information abroad and more broadly with vendors in the future, you're not necessarily bound to PII data. How do you ensure that there are certain pseudo IDs in place that identify somebody without really identifying them? How do you ensure that information and security policies are set only to the need to know basis? That's something that HR has historically never really had to grapple with. But now we're truly getting into the realms of, does your HR business partner need to see everything, or do we bifurcate information from them?
Yeah.
And on top of that, from a compliance standpoint, I think the regulatory environment is changing quite rapidly over the last 6-7 years pertaining to data collection, sensitive data collection. With the new EU AI ruling right now, even the application of facial recognition is limited. We can see the fines and the penalties of violation increasing dramatically as well with every round of regulation that is being pushed out. So in that regard, then, how do you architect something that is flexible enough that can allow you to do the work that you need to get done, but also gives you the flexibility to not overcome, but to stay in compliance with any current or future potential regulations. And I think that's a lot of the question that HR as a function is still trying to dial into, if you will, because if you think about historically how we've implemented systems as a function, we've always just put the system in. We said, we'll take a look at it in 2 years' time and we'll do continuous improvement projects on it based on requirements, rinse and repeat over and over again. Well, with AI and the existing technology cycle, that 2 years, quite frankly, has become 2 months, if not 2 weeks, depending on the span and scope of an organization. And I think that level of flexibility and adaptability is something that HR has to indoctrinate into its culture and as a function.
Yeah. So let's look ahead for a second and think about the evolution of AI in the HR industry. What do you see happening? Where do you see significant advancements taking place?
I'm going to start with the next 12 to 18 months, because I think with the rapid development of AI, I'd be remiss if I were to forecast any further than that. I think where it's going to go in the next 12 to 18 months is very similar to how people analytics was about 3-4 years ago. AI is going to become much more frequently spoken about. However, HR practitioners as individuals will likely have more exposure on the consumer side to AI than they would on the professional side in HR. So I think it's one of those social media things where people will naturally adopt and use it in their personal lives before they're going to use it in their work lives. The utilization of AI in people's personal lives, I think, will propel the conversation at work to say, if AI can do this for me, why are we not thinking about it this way at work? And I think that's going to be a conversation that drives the adoption of some early stage AI technology. And the reason why I'm saying early stage is because more and more I'm noticing those in the industry to be more cognizant of data. Early stage being, let's feed a policy or two into the AI model. Let's get the chatbot working first. Let's make sure that we can get rid of some of the administrative tier 0 work. And then we're going to figure out what tier 1, 2, and 3 afterwards look like. I do think in 18 months from now, a lot of our industry is going to be stuck in that tier 0. I'm going to call it the chatbot world, if you will, and kind of being happy there, which is totally fine. While the AI side of technology industry is still trying to figure out how to get HR to adopt to it as a function. And quite frankly, how do you make it an economically sustainable model from the tool and platform sales perspectives?
Wow, that's tremendous insight. Thank you. So we've reached our time today, Lydia, and I have one final question for you. And this is something I'd like to ask all of our guests. If S2 Verify were to conduct a background investigation on you, would there be any surprises?
Ooh, okay. Would there be any surprises? I think you'll find 2 parking tickets, which I paid early, if that tells you about who I am as a person. And S2 Verify might not dig this up, but I will reveal it. You will also find that I managed to crack last edition of the New York Times Sunday crossword puzzle in under 30 minutes.
Oh, fabulous, fabulous. Wow. Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure talking with you today. Where can our audience, track what's going on with you and get some insights?
Absolutely. So LinkedIn is my preferred channel. I do a bi-weekly post up there called a series called Oops, Did I Think That Out Loud, in terms of people analytics, HR, technology, future of work, and all of those things. And if they pop onto my LinkedIn profile, there's also a little link where they can book a one-on-one coffee chat with me, and we can definitely dive into a lot more details.
That's wonderful. Wonderful. Thanks so much. So before we sign off, I'd like to have a minute with Bill and Jim, my partners at S2 Verify. I know there's been discussion in the last 8 or 9 months with artificial intelligence. And why don't you give some insight about the limitations with that? Especially, I know that there are some federal agencies that have made some reference about that and how it could be utilized. You got any insight on that, Jim?
Well, Arnaud, as you're aware, we currently deploy it. We deploy it with robotics and records. We also deploy it inside of the application now with how we term is grading, when a client has a set of criteria that determines how an individual is graded. Grading means how that crime's assessed. And we also use it on the compliance side in the platform for looking at very objective kind of rules that the AI works fine for. We aren't deploying it in the adjudication world. We haven't found, Billy can comment on this. The way that I would depict this quickest is the MVR world years and years ago, motor vehicle records, went to what was called a universal code. So one of the things that employers were frustrated by is if you pulled an MVR in Michigan and then pulled an MVR in Pennsylvania, they're both DUIs, but they have nothing to do with each other. And more importantly, they can say the same thing in different language: driving while intoxicated, driving under the influence, etc. So the CRAs got together years ago, Equifax, a big driver in that process, of bringing a standard code so that what's a DUI in Nevada is a DUI in Illinois is a DUI in New York. Okay. This has been talked about over and over again in public records or criminal records, of using AI to depict a universal process. The dilemma has to do with how many court jurisdictions, Billy?
3,100.
3,100 jurisdictions, probably. When you get into sub courts, felony courts, and misdemeanor courts, probably doubling, tripling down on that. But the inability, Arnett, to cast a common thread through that court system where AI could be really beneficial because of the difference in language, statutes, for lack of a better term, the way a crime is depicted or defined is extremely challenging. Billy, I know you and I talked about this before. You want to add to it?
Yeah, I think, the biggest issue is we don't want to categorize individuals in crimes to some extent, because then you're basically going against what the EOC wants to do. And so we're individually looking at crimes, looking at, the background. We're calling the DOC, Department of Corrections, to see when they got out. So, you can't have an AI system that does those types of things. And so it's more investigative in the sense of, verifying the information versus going, oh, everybody with a felony, blah, 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 goes in this category. And so, I think there's going to be a lot of litigation around AI, because I think we have competitors out there that are using just strictly AI for adjudication, and they're missing records, or they're calling somebody that, doesn't have a criminal record. They're actually saying that they have a criminal record. So they're not going to the M3 to verify that information. So if you use broad brush, AI and categorization and everything else, and there's just a lot of innocent people that are being called felons or, showing up with a criminal record when it's not them.
For our audience, please tune in next week when we continue our exploration of topics critical to success in HR. We'll see you then. And it goes without saying, let's get America back to work, because dreams only work if we do. Lydia, thank you so much for joining. It's been a great conversation today.
Thanks for having me.
If you want to stay abreast of HR, recruiting, and hiring trends, tips, and tools, make sure you subscribe to America Back to Work. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a rating and a review.